everybody, it's Ryan Metzler here again, and today we're going to take a look at a game from game publisher Capstone Games. This is a reprint. We're going to take a look at Wildcatters, which is a game about drilling for, collecting, shipping, and delivering oil to various continents in order to earn more victory points or prestige, or whatever you want to call them, oil drops in this game, than the other players. The game is rather involved, so real quick, why don't we take a look at what you get inside of the box. We'll see how the game plays. We'll come back at the end and get my opinions on Wildcatters. So here you can see the setup for Wildcatters. Now, each player in this game is representing, I guess, an oil company, and they are working to drill for oil, transport that oil to various different continents, and score points at the end of the game. Each player is going to start the game with a variety of components. You can see some oil rigs here. They have pump jacks that will replace those oil rigs. They're going to have some trains, some boats, some refineries, a bunch of oil, and then each player starts with some shares depending on where they're sitting. So this player has started with 20 of their own shares, and they start with 5 blue shares because blue is sitting to their left. They also have 20 workers that they're going to use throughout the game, and they are the first player to act in this game. Additionally, you'll see players have components out on the board. I didn't want to go through showing you all of the setup, but there is a player-based setup at the start of the game where each player is dealt 8 of these location cards. Each location card will actually show on it a location on the board. So this is one of the, I guess, 8 areas on the board in North America, corresponding to this area up here, and the player that had this card would have been allowed to play one of their player pieces there in turn order to start out the game. So each player is going to set up 3 of their oil rigs. They're going to set up 2 trains. They're going to set up 1 boat and a refinery out on the board. And that will be the starting positions for the game. After you've set all of this up, you're going to place these little Wildcatter discs out on the board, and these are like independent oil companies that kind of come into the areas that aren't filled in that well on the board. So each area that only has, or that has any area will get 1 of these discs, and if there's only 1 or 2 pump jacks in the area, I guess 2 or less pump jacks, it's going to get a second one. It's less than 2. Now, after you've done all that, you're going to move on to playing the game. And as I said, the turn order is predetermined, and it doesn't change until potentially the last round. On your turn, you're going to do several things. They're all outlined by these wonderful player aids. So this is actually very nice because otherwise I think the game would be very confusing. So the first thing you must do on your turn is you must take one of these cards that's over here. And these cards are going to dictate what area of the board you may act in. So these exist for all 8 of the areas. There's 2 kind of in Southern Asia, 2 in Russia/China over here, 2 in the US, and 2 in South America. So there's 8 total areas. And then you'll see these white areas on the board that can be acted in. So a player may grab one of these cards they're going to grab one of these cards to determine where they might act. Perhaps this player decides to choose, I don't know, let's just pick one randomly, this Russia card here. Now, this Russia card will give them 3 victory points at the end of the game, and it lets them act in this upper quadrant over here. Now, the green player doesn't really have anything there, so they may not choose this. Let's pretend that it's for this area right here, but just know that this dictates what area you can work in. Some of these cards may have instant actions on them. For example, this one right here will let you take 2 workers were you to choose it. It's going to get you 2 workers and 2 blue shares, but no victory points. Whereas other ones may just get you a victory point and some workers, and those workers you will use to take your actions. So you take a card, you get the bonuses on it, and you act in that area. The actions you may take are also laid out in a fairly firm order. So the first thing you can do in an area, let's say we chose this area, is build in it. And when you build, you have several things you can build. You may build your oil rigs, you may build your trains, you may build your boats, and you can build your refineries. The costs to build these things are all laid out in workers. So for example, building one of these rigs is going to cost you 4 workers, whereas building trains and boats costs you 2 apiece. And building a refinery is very, very expensive. Building a refinery actually costs you, I'm forgetting the number right now, but it's 12. So it's going to cost you 12 workers to build this. Now, there are designated locations for rigs, so rigs can be built on all these little circles. The trains can be built in the area you're in on the little rectangles. The refineries can be built on the larger rectangles. You'll see this one's already full, so I couldn't build it there. And the boats can be built into the harbors. In addition, with these cards, you are allowed to build in these white continents, and you can pick one white continent to build in, and you may build a train in that continent, should you like. You may build your refineries in that continent, should you like. And the reasons to do so will become obvious here in a little bit. So once you're done with all of your building, let's say green decides to build a couple of their rigs over here in this area. That would cost them 8 workers. They can spend their 10 here and get 2 back as cards. So now they've done that. They want to move on out of the build area. They're done with that. So now they're going to move on to the oil actions. And the oil actions are 3 different actions that can be taken. The first of which is to drill for oil. So we've got these rigs out here, but they're not doing anything. In any area where there is at least 4 oil rigs, it doesn't matter whose they are. It just has to be 4 total. You may drill for oil. And drilling for oil is going to cost the player that initiates it 8 workers. So they have to spend 8 workers. Our player here does have 8 left, so let's say he spent these workers, and this is the last time I'm actually going to deal in workers for real purposes. But he spends those 8 workers, and that allows him to initiate drilling in this area. And what he does is he replaces one of his rigs with a pump jack. And with that pump jack comes 3 oil. So he's hit oil in this area, and one of his rigs will convert. Every other player with at least 1 rig there has the option of converting that rig into a pump jack and getting the 3 oil. In order to do so, they must pay 3 of their shares to the player that initiated it, and those shares will be useful for that player later in the game. So it becomes a, do I pay the shares to convert my oil rig, helping the other player, or do I really not need to do this at this point in time? So they could pay their 3 shares, put down their pump jack, and now have 3 oil. In addition, after the conversion, anybody that has a pump jack in that region will be involved in an auction for these Wildcatter discs. And these discs are worth points at the end of the game, and they also come with some oil for the player who wins them. That auction, like I said, only goes to the players who have pump jacks, so only the flat discs, not the standing towers. That auction starts at 4 shares of your own color and goes around the table until all players have either passed or one player has the high bid, and that player wins that disc. And out on that disc will go one of their oil, which they'll want to clear later to get that disc and get victory points at the end of the game. The second of the oil actions involves area that have already been drilled, meaning they have at least 1 pump jack, and what it does is it allows you to convert your other oil rigs in that area, or oil rigs that you decided not to convert earlier, into pump jacks and get oil. It costs you 3 workers per one of these that you want to convert, and you get the oil for them. So it's just simply a way to get those converted so that you can be involved in transporting oil later. The last oil action is going to be transporting oil. And transporting oil costs 4 workers and initiates a transport for everybody in the area. When you initiate a transport, you're transporting that oil to the nearest harbor initially. So everybody will transport, if they decide to the nearest harbor, and that's these little areas with the anchors on them. The player that initiates it must take 1 oil off of each one of their pump jacks, as well as any Wildcatter discs they own, and transport it. Now, in this case, we can't transport because there's no train here to transport from the oil fields out to the harbor. But let's say green had their train here instead. At this point, green would be able to move these 2 oil out to the harbor, and nobody else would be involved because nobody else has a pump jack there. But if blue did, they would have the ability to move 1 oil. If blue did move an oil across green's train, they would owe green a share. So they're going to have to pay a share to use that player's transportation. Once everything is at the harbor, you can choose where to put it. It can either go into the refinery that's local, so green can deliver their 2 oil here to this local refinery, which is their own refinery, and that would be the end of it. If blue did have an oil, they could also deliver to this refinery, and green would actually have to pay blue 2 of their own color shares, so 2 green shares, for delivering oil to that player's refinery. So anytime oil is delivered to a refinery that is not of that color, so blue to green or yellow to green or red to green, the green player will owe the delivering player 2 shares of their own color. Now you want to get these oil to this refineries because you'll see that it goes out for scoring later in the game. If you don't want to deliver to the local refinery, it's possible that you have your tanker over here or that some other player has their tanker in the area. Let's say yellow had moved their tanker here and green decided they didn't want to sell to their own area. They can place their oil on yellow's tanker. Now, since you're using yellow, green would owe yellow shares for doing this. And then if yellow had any oil on here, they would control where this tanker is going. Since they don't, green can choose to move this tanker anywhere they like, perhaps over to here, putting these 2 green onto the yellow refinery, and now yellow owes 4 shares to green for doing this. So they did a little bit of a back and forth. But in this way, you can deliver oil to different areas, not just those kind of landlocked or not accessible by train. And if somebody has built refineries out in Africa or Australia, for example, or Europe over here, you can get to those as well, either by train or by boat. After you've done this, if you haven't moved your boat for the turn or you haven't used your boats for the turn, you may move them to whatever location you want. The first one for free, and each additional one will cost you 1 worker in order to move it. After you have finished your turn for using all of the building and transporting of oil and all of these things, you're going to go ahead and you're going to have any refineries that are completely full of oil empty. So let's say that this yellow refinery here had completely filled up with oil during the turn. What's going to happen is the yellow player is going to deliver this, despite it not really being their turn, to the appropriate continent, in this case South America. All of the oil that's not of yellow's own color, so all of the blue and green oil here, will automatically get delivered to the continent. And the yellow player, since they own the refinery, will get 4 shares per oil delivered in this manner of any color they would like. So they could take, a bunch of red or a bunch of blue, doesn't really matter what color. Now, the yellow one, they have a choice on, since it's their own. They can either send it to the continent and get nothing for it, but it will be part of endgame scoring, or they can take it back and they can get 4 more shares of whatever colors they would like. And these shares are, of course, beneficial as well. But they're always going to get 4 per oil for everybody else, and then they have the choice on their own oil. Perhaps they decide to send it here. They would get 16 total shares in whatever colors they would like. After they've got their shares, they can come over here, and once per turn you can buy a consolidation chip in the area that you acted in. So if they had been acting in South America, or if they had been acting in Russia, they would have a choice of buying these chips. And the chips get more expensive the more of them that are bought. So for example, at the beginning of the game, each one of these chips costs 2 shares of each color. So if they were acting in South America, they could pay 2 red, 2 yellow, 2 blue, and 2 green, and they could take the top chip of this pile. These chips are worth victory points at the end of the game, and they're going to give you a share of your own color at the start of every round from this point on. So it's a way to accumulate shares as you go. And they're also, of course, good for victory points. These do get more expensive, but they also become worth more victory points. So, for example, the third one down is worth 7 in this case, whereas the first one's only worth 2. So you have to weigh the costs and benefits of getting more victory points versus more shares as the game goes on. After you finish the round, you're going to dump the closest card to the deck. You're going to slide all of these down, and since one will have been chosen, you'll actually have 2 cards gone. You'll refill with 2 more, and then the next player will take their turn. As soon as everybody has taken 7 turns in the 4-player game, or 8 turns in the 2- and 3-player game, the game will end. Now, the game ends, and you score various things. So your cards, of course, have victory points on them. You're going to score points at the end of the game for the number of these Wildcatter discs you have gotten, and that goes up rather exponentially. You will score points for the number of refineries you have built, and that goes up rather quickly as well. You're going to score points for the number of workers you have, and every 3 shares will convert to 1 worker, and whoever has the most will get 8 points, second most 4 points, and third most 2 points. You will score points for a little chip that you start the game with that's worth 2 victory points, and allows you to empty one of your refineries before it's full if you see the need to deliver those shares to the continent, or those oil to the continent early. And then you're going to score majority in each one of these continents. Each continent is worth, the first place majority is 16, second place in majority is 8, and third place is 4, with ties being split between the 2 tying players for the 2 positions that they would have normally scored. In addition, if you had any loans in the game, and loans happen when you need to pay out shares, for example, but can't not afford to, you will get a 10-share loan. You must pay those back at the beginning of round 5 for 18 shares, or at the end of the game, they cost you 25 of your own shares, and you lose 1 point for each share you cannot repay. With that said, you accumulate all of those points, adding in those from the consolidation chips that you can buy, and whoever has the most points will be the winner. Well, there you have it. That is Wildcatters from Capstone Games. This is a game that I was a little bit, I don't know, scared of is the wrong word, but maybe turned off by a little bit when I first got it and read through the rules, because the rules, when you read them, are not very straightforward. And part of this is the fact that the game is rather complex in terms of the order of execution and number of actions that you have to deal with. But when you really get down to it and you take a look at the player aid and you have the components in front of you and you start moving through things, the game becomes much easier to understand. The first play is a little bit of a slog because you're like, okay, well, how much does it cost to build a refinery, what cards let me do what, when I do this, who else gets to trigger off of it, what's the order of execution when it comes to shipping things, who has priority, this, that, and the other. And it really seems like a lot, but when you really boil it down and you play it 2, 3, 4 times, things really become a lot more clear, and the order of operations is not that confusing. With that said, still have the player aids in front of you because it's a great reminder of how many workers things cost, and my brain can never remember any of that. The game has quite a bit of strategy to it, but a lot of it is tied up in those cards, and it can fall to a scenario where having the wrong cards available to you hurts you significantly. Maybe you really need to act in the northern part of North America, and that card's just not available to you when your turn comes around. There is a mechanism to cycle the cards. It costs you victory points, and oftentimes this is not a terrible move to make because those victory points can really open the board up for you and allow you to score a lot more simply by giving you the card that you need to move forward. But you certainly don't want to do that repeatedly, spending 4 points a pop to replace the 8 cards that are available. Taking a loan seems like a really bad idea, and it is kind of a really bad idea because you're taking a 10-share loan in order to pay out 18 shares later, or 25 if you're unable to do it when you are offered the opportunity to pay your loan. However, it seems almost inevitable in your first game, and likely if the other players know what they're doing in future games, that you will end up with at least one loan. Because there is quite a bit of screw your neighbor or screw the other players here, where you can simply see that they've either spent their shares down to do something, or they're low on shares from other people making deliveries to their refineries, where you simply target deliveries to the refinery so that they have to pay out shares to you and take that loan to hurt them later in the game. So there's a huge factor of timing in terms of being low on shares and looking for other players that are low on shares in order to kind of force them to give up some points. In reality, this is a great game. I was very irked with the components when I first got them because you have to sticker like 170 million stickers onto the board, or not the board, but the components. But really, the kind of feel that gives the game and the look that it has when placed out on the table is amazing. The game is well designed. The rules leave a little bit to be desired, but once you get through them, they're great. And if this is a game that you're at all interested in the theme, you're at all interested in games that I enjoy, I recommend you check it out. That's Wildcatters.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.